Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Cora and I'm with the representative of German Business, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first part of our Transatlantic Energy Efficiency Forum. The topic of today's virtual conference is the roadmap towards zero-emission buildings. This week, we are hosting a virtual building efficiency program for German companies in that space. And in the course of this program, we have organized today's conference. I invite you to join me for the next 2 hours to learn about German and California developments, policies, and initiatives in the building efficiency sector. We will hear 2 keynote speakers from both sides of the Atlantic, 2 German companies, Engelmann and Global Assistant, and a great panel that will discuss social equity. How can we ensure energy efficiency for all communities? But before we begin, I want to thank our great partners for supporting this event. All of them either foster the transatlantic exchange between Germany and the US and/or focus on creating a sustainable future. The German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, the Council General of the Federal Republic of Germany of San Francisco, the Council General of the Federal Republic of Los Angeles, Germany Trade and Invest, RENAC, the US Green Building Council LA, Better Building Challenge LA, Shift Zero, the Northwest Energy Coalition, Spark Northwest, Northwest Energy Efficiency Council, and Clean Tech Alliance. In addition, I would like to thank my team, Olivia Lambert, Felix Loxen, and Efi Segura, for supporting on bringing this program together. Should you have any technical issues, please contact them in the chat directly. For questions to speakers and the presenting companies, feel free to use the Q&A function, and the questions can be answered by the speakers directly. But now, to start the conference, I would like to hand it over to Sven Thorsten Potthoff, our CEO here at GSCC West, for a few welcome words.
Thank you, Cora, for thanking everybody. So I think it's on me to thank you, finally. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning in Germany and good afternoon here on the West Coast. On behalf of the German-American Chamber of Commerce in the Western United States, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar titled The Roadmap Towards Zero-Emission Buildings, focusing the Californian part today. We all know President Biden's ambitious climate goals lay a strong foundation for decarbonizing the energy and building sectors. This is critical because the building sector is a significant contributor to overall US energy consumption. And through various state initiatives, the administration is making its efforts clear to become more energy efficient. A closer look at California and Washington State reveals that both share the same mindset and ambitious goals as the current administration in our capital in DC. California has long been considered the leading US state in terms of environmental and climate policy. Among its goals is to have 100% of its electricity come from renewable energy by 2045. Washington State has more or less similar goals to use 100% carbon-free energy by 2045 and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 95% by 2050. And I assume you will hear these numbers in the coming days a lot more. The thriving tech and startup industry, strong sustainability awareness among the population, and ambitious regulations and incentive programs related to energy efficiency provide favorable conditions in both states. The size and incredible diversity of the country have a positive impact on the opportunities for German companies looking to bring new technologies to market. In the field of building efficiency, SMEs are entering a fiercely competitive situation. Let's be clear about that. However, it is more than beneficial that new and innovative approaches and business models that go beyond the technology currently established in California and Washington State are urgently required, and that Germany takes a pioneering role in the field of energy efficiency and these technologies. For me personally, that sounds like a perfect match. So this was my modest take on a topic you're all dealing with on a regular, if not daily basis. You're the experts, not me. Therefore, I will leave it at that. I wish us all an interesting and inspiring webinar full of insights on this important topic. Thank you all, and now back to my colleague Cora.
Thank you, Sven. Next, we will hear welcome remarks from Stefan Schneider, Consul General for the Federal Republic of Germany of Los Angeles. Mr. Consul General, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning on the West Coast and good afternoon or early evening in Germany and all those who might listen to us from all over the world. Thank you for the initiative, GACC and Sven Potthoff. A special welcome also to you, Sven, and thank you you have said something very important. I leave it to the experts. I'm always saying I am not an expert, but I'm really pleased that I may say a few words of greetings. So I'm always saying when it comes to emission, the issue is, of course, has a double focus. It's like we have national efforts from the German federal government, and we have globalization efforts and efforts within the framework of the European Union. We have in Germany the Climate Action Program 2030. You all know, the experts know even more, but those who are listening outside of the experts circle, we have a binding reduction of emission of greenhouse gases of 55% till by 2030 in Germany. This is a goal, and we have a Climate Change Act, Klimaschutzgesetz in action, and we are trying to get away from coal, and we want to renovate buildings because it is, some facts might be interesting for those who do not know Germany so well, that about 14% of all CO2 emissions in Germany are produced by the building sector. But this is a figure of 2018. We do not have new figures available, but it's still, I think, valid. And about 22 million buildings in Germany, around 12.5 million residential buildings were built before 1977. And this is interesting to know because it was before we all had this regulation and this awareness for climate change. We had already, I remember that as a student, the Club of Rome report. Older people might have read it already, and some people have forgot it. You should all read it. It's still valid. And what the Club of Rome said in the 70s, it's still valid. Also, warming, the warming effect of greenhouse gases and everything was already a topic in this report. And in Germany, 60% of the energy consumption is in buildings. It's by heating. And as we know, we have now the crisis in Europe, and we have really problems to get heated up our buildings. And even more, we are now like striving for even getting that goal, being less dependent on energy, which is we call kind of old-fashioned, I would always say. I always use this one, and we are getting away from coal, getting away from gas, and trying to strengthen the renewable energy resources. And even more, we have to proceed with the building renovation. As also again this background, and I fear this winter that might be some lessons because we realize that to heat a building needs a lot of energy. And as I said already, that there are so many buildings in Germany needing renovation. And with the newest technology we are inventing. The other aspect, the other focus is the European Union. And whatever we do in Germany is not just done in Germany, it's a globalization issue. And so we do everything within the European Union framework. It's also a legal framework. We have the European Green Deal. You might all know this. The deal is achieving zero net emissions by 2050. And this European Green Deal is a roadmap for the European Union to become climate neutral by 2050. And the European Union is working on achieving a circular economy by 2050, creating a sustainable food system and protecting biodiversity and pollinators. That's one side, but it's also regarding buildings and construction. The built environment has also in the European Union a significant impact on many sectors of the economy, on local jobs and quality of life. It requires vast amounts of resources and accounts for about 50% of all extracted material. The construction sector is responsible for over 35% of the EU's total waste generation. Greenhouse gas emissions from material extraction, manufacture of construction products, as well as construction renovation of buildings are estimated at 5 to 12% of total national emissions. Greater material efficiency could save 80% of those emissions. So the European Union would set up goals and would promote principles throughout the life cycle of buildings, but I do not want to bore you with very specific EU regulations. They are very specific when it comes to the durability and adaptability of built assets or digital logbooks or integrate life cycle assessment in public procurement. There are very many topics. They're very technical, very specific. But to summarize, it is to go this road towards zero emission buildings is in the core of our society. It's an important issue. It's not just for experts. It really concerns us all. And I'm really grateful and thankful to the JCC West again for having this initiative and also to include my colleagues from San Francisco and myself into the discussion. And I wish you great discussions and a great day, and thank all to those who are on the panels and to share their knowledge with us. Thank you very much indeed. Auf Wiedersehen und einen guten Verlauf. Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Mr. Consul General, for your welcome remarks and for taking the time to further highlight these important issues. Now it's time for our first keynote. Please welcome with me Craig Perkins, President and Executive Director at the Energy Coalition. He has been President of the Energy Coalition since 2008 and has led the design and implementation of energy programs and policies which incorporate outreach strategies to key stakeholder groups, including creation of California's regional energy networks and execution of innovative distributed energy resources solutions for public agencies and disadvantaged communities. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yes, I can see it.
All right. So thank you for the introduction. Very happy to be here today. And I'm going to go through quite a bit of information and try to do it very quickly because you have to hear a lot of things today, and you're not going to remember it all, but hopefully you'll remember some of the important parts. The first thing I want to do is explain who the Energy Coalition is. We're a nonprofit organization. We've been around for about 45 years, and most of that time we've been designing and implementing energy efficiency projects and programs and increasingly integrated energy solutions, working with mostly public agencies, but also with communities. And so what I'm going to share with you today is what I've learned while I've been at the Energy Coalition in terms of what's happening now in California, but also based on my experience prior to being with the Energy Coalition, working for a California city, the city of Santa Monica, for over 20 years. So hopefully you'll find it interesting and it won't repeat too much of the stuff you already know. Whoops. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about California. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. We believe, at least, that we greatly influence the rest of the country and the world. And one thing that we do agree on for the most part is that climate change is indeed an existential threat to humanity, and we are trying to act accordingly. So what's good about the California experience? We've been very successful with energy efficiency over the past 45 years. We now have the lowest per capita energy use in the US, and also very low per capita energy spending, even though there's a lot of complaining in California about energy costs. We have the strongest energy efficiency requirements for new construction in the country. We're leading the United States in renewable energy production. We have led the United States in appliance and vehicle efficiency standards, much of which has been adopted by a lot of other states in the country. And right now, we're currently funding energy efficiency programs at about $1.5 billion per year, and that's going to be increasing. Just a couple of charts, because you don't just want to see text, you want to see some pictures here. annual energy consumption per capita in the United States compared to California, you can see that what has happened since the 1960s. And also the success of California's energy efficiency programs for buildings, appliances, and other energy using measures. Not quite up to date, but from 1975 to 2015 at least. Okay, so but what's the bad? What are some of the challenges? First of all, we now recognize that electrification of everything is the reality, the future reality that we have to deal with and implement. And what that means that fossil gas and oil, gasoline, diesel predominantly need to be eliminated from our energy system. But there is strong opposition and pushback from those interests that represent the fossil gas and oil industries. And we deal with that in California on a regular basis. The existing residential and commercial buildings account for about 70% of electricity consumption and 50% of the gas consumption in California. About 50% of our existing buildings were built before 1978, and that's when the Title 24 energy efficiency standards were first established in California. But it's really more than that. If buildings built in the 1980s are very deficient compared to current energy efficiency standards, which are updated about every 2 years. So there's a lot of existing buildings that need to be retrofitted and upgraded to meet more appropriate and acceptable energy efficiency standards in California. Participation in energy efficiency programs has historically been low, and unfortunately, the actual energy efficiency savings from participation are frequently less than the engineering estimates, and that's leading to a more meter-based evaluation approach for energy efficiency programs I'll talk about a little later. And the barriers to both efficiency and electrification projects can be significant. A lot of those barriers are at the local level, cities and counties, the permitting agencies for work that gets done on buildings are sometimes the most resistant to change and cause the most heartache and headache in terms of getting projects approved and done. So how do we turn the bad into good? Already, a lot of cities and counties in California require 100% electrification in new construction. The largest one up to date is the city of Los Angeles, which adopted that as a legal requirement a few months ago. And California, I'm predicting, will likely adopt the same statewide standard for electrification and of all new construction by 2025 or 2026. Also, as was noted by the earlier speaker, legislative actions both in California and Washington are going to result in enormous amounts of new direct funding investments, as well as tax credits for energy efficiency, electrification, distributed energy resources, and a whole spectrum of energy system investments and clean energy investments. And now we are trying to figure out how that money is going to flow, how it's going to be administered, what the timing will be, and what the criteria for getting access to that funding for projects and programs will be. So it's a very exciting time, but a lot of uncertainty. And very importantly, there is a very, very strong emphasis on low-income, disadvantaged, and vulnerable communities, and how those customers will not be left behind in the energy transformation that's taking place. And that includes a significant workforce education and training investments for both existing and new contractors and workforce, trying to expand the accessibility of these new energy jobs to a more diverse workforce. And quite importantly, just within the last month, two regulatory legal mandates were adopted in California. 100% now of all retail electricity sales in California must be from renewable sources by 2045, but the milestones are 90% all renewable by 2035 and 95% by 2040. The previous requirement was 60% renewable by 2030. So this is now a roadmap to zero carbon electricity in California. And as importantly, 100% of all new cars and light trucks sold in California must be zero emission by 2035. And the milestones there are 35% by 2026 and 68% by 2030. California already has the largest amount of electric vehicles that have been purchased and are in use, but that needs to increase significantly over the next decade in order to meet these new mandates. So just one little side note in terms of electrification in California, and also reflected in the national legislation and the recent California legislation and funding. Heat pump systems are very important. Heat pump water heaters, heat pump space heating and cooling. And this chart just shows you sort of the trend line, which we expect to occur with heat pump water heaters. There's a lot of money being invested in water heater retrofits to heat pump water heaters. And there are significant incentives that are currently being offered, but the payback in terms of reduced carbon emissions and increased energy efficiency are enormous. And so this trend is going to accelerate. Okay, so what's next? Looking in the crystal ball a little bit here. Energy efficiency will be designed within the context of electrification. And so that's going to cause some changes in terms of the identification, analysis, and implementation of energy efficiency. But also, energy efficiency is going to be increasingly tied to temporal and locational benefits. What do I mean? Energy efficiency, the value of energy efficiency, energy savings is very much tied to the time of day and the day of the week that those savings occur. And it's also very much increasingly tied to the location on the grid where those projects occur in terms of alleviating grid constraints or other issues which can defer or make unnecessary investments in grid distribution infrastructure. And so those values are increasingly a part of the energy planning, system planning in California, but we've been very slow to implement the specifics of how that's going to relate to specific projects and programs. And energy efficiency increasingly will be seen and implemented within the broader context of integrated demand-side management, integrated distributed energy resource projects, and sort of how there can be synergies between the energy efficiency and other installations and projects are going to occur on the same site or in the same proximity to accrue maximum value from the EE investments. And very controversially, and this is a discussion going on right now at the California Public Utilities Commission with a lot of pushback from the gas interests, fossil gas measures will eventually be excluded from participation in energy efficiency. The current proposal that they start being phased out in 2024 may or may not happen, but it's inevitable. I like to use a famous quote from the movie Casablanca that Humphrey Bogart spoke, which is, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and forever, fossil gas measures will be excluded from participation in energy efficiency programs. And as importantly, in California particularly, there is a tremendous influence being placed on equity issues and affordability issues and participation by low income and disadvantaged community customers in energy efficiency programs, as well as other energy projects and programs in transformation of sort of our energy system. And as I mentioned earlier, more energy efficiency programs are going to rely on meter-based performance incentives, both on the customer side as well as the implementer side, in terms of how the value and the effectiveness of those programs is going to be evaluated and compensated. And but most importantly to me, energy projects are going to remain the least cost customer option and opportunity in most cases. But it's going to be a much more holistic evaluation of how what the right energy efficiency project is at the right place at the right time, integrated with the other energy investments that are being made, either by that customer or within that community or contiguous sites. And one important change, which I want to mention here, which definitely significantly impacts energy efficiency programs, is the proliferation of community choice aggregation authorities within California. This is a state law which has been on the books for almost 20 years, but over the last 5 years, there has been a tremendous increase in the establishment of these community choice aggregation authorities, which are consortia of local governments, cities and counties, which take control of the retail sales of electricity to the customers within their territory. They don't own wires. They don't own substations. They don't own any of the distribution or transmission system. They simply are in the business of procuring wholesale electricity and delivering it to their retail customers. And the reason that this has happened in most cases, two main reasons. Number one, that the electricity can be delivered in a lot of instances cheaper than the serving investor-owned utility. And number two, many of these cities and counties want to have a cleaner mix of electricity for themselves and their communities. And right now, there are about 11 million California customers that are served by these community choice aggregation authorities. The newest one in San Diego is going to be very large, and within 5 years, 75% of the retail electricity sales in California are going to be managed by these community choice aggregation authorities, and they have access to energy efficiency funding through an application to the Public Utilities Commission. Marin Clean Energy is the largest one right now, but there's a number of other of these authorities that are choosing to get involved in energy efficiency program implementation and are getting access to funding through the CPUC. The Energy Coalition is very much focused on energy improvements in disadvantaged communities. And we're working on a couple of pilot programs. And we believe that this also is a very strong trend in California, which is going to receive increased focus, increased funding, and increased attention. And what we're really trying to create are advanced energy communities, which are able to integrate many approaches, both on individual sites, as well as collectively, community solar and other collective projects, which are going to increase the affordability of energy, increase the benefits, both economic and environmental within the communities, as well as create pathways to clean energy for customers, under-resourced customers that otherwise would not be able to do so. And finally, just to put this in context, why do we care? Right now, the California retail energy sales are over $40 billion annually, and that is going to increase as we think about the electrification of everything, particularly as we talk about transportation electrification. I didn't speak a lot about transportation electrification, but that is going to become an increasingly important part of grid design and supply planning, energy supply planning. Vehicle to grid technologies are being piloted. I believe that they're going to be standard within the next 10 years. And all of those millions of essentially batteries on wheels are going to be connected and integrated into power planning, as well as the customer compensation in terms of the outflow and the inflow of electricity to customer sites. So it's an exciting time. There's tremendous opportunity, tremendous challenges, and a lot to figure out and a lot to still learn as we move forward. And so with that, I thank you for your time this morning. Happy to respond to any questions in the chat. And I hope that the rest of the webinar is more interesting and exciting than my presentation, but I did my best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig, for your insightful keynote. I think this gives us some really inspiration of what is possible within the energy efficiency space in California. So now to represent the German perspective, we will hear from Olaf Böttcher, Head of Division Energy Optimized Buildings at the Federal Institute of Research on Building, Urban Affairs, and Special Development. He studied energy efficiency at the TU Berlin. After graduating, he worked as a research associate at the Hermann Ritschl Institute for Heating, Ventilation, and Air Conditioning. And afterwards, he was employed at the Institute for Rehabilitation and Modernization of Buildings as research associate and head of department. By order of the Federal Ministry of Transportation, Building, and Urban Development, he has the position as Federal Energy Commissioner since November 2008. Please help me welcome Olaf Böttcher.
Thank you for the introduction and also for the invitation to that event. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and at the same time, good evening, wherever you take part. I'm going to speak about the energy efficiency requirements in Germany's buildings. I would like to give you some information about the legal framework. Some of the points already mentioned by Mr. Schneider. It was an excellent keyword, I have to say. And I would like to give you also some information to some project examples from my work as a Federal Commissioner for Energy, that are all project examples from federal buildings. So federal buildings are buildings which are owned and occupied by the federal government. Let's start with the first slide with objectives in terms of climate protection. I would like to mention that the climate protection is in Germany is part of the legal framework. Since 2019, we have the Climate Protection Act, and within this act are some objectives written down and defined, and we have to follow to achieve that. It came into effect, as mentioned, in 2019, but in the year 2021, there was a next version, Climate Protection Act 2.0. There was a tightening of the requirements was written in that act, especially the time frame was changed. In 2019, the time frame was set until 2050. Meanwhile, with the Climate Protection Act 2021, the time frame is set until 2045. We have to achieve a climate neutral building stock. On our way to that main objective, there are defined some milestones. There are also defined some sectors, the different sectors with certain emission reduction aims and objectives. So the building sector is, as mentioned here on that slide, the first milestone we have to achieve is in 2030, the reduction of CO2 emissions to approximately absolute value and absolute number 67 million tons. That means in comparison with the CO2 emissions of the building sector to 1919, a reduction of 143 million tons. There's within the frame or within the act is also mentioned the second milestone is milestone 2040. And with that milestone, the building sector is allowed to emit only approximately 25 million tons. So there's a huge reduction. We have to achieve a huge reduction of CO2 emissions in our sector, in the building sector. For new buildings, what does it mean? We have to achieve the nearly zero energy standard. That standard is coming from the European level. It is in the European Performance of Buildings Directive written down or defined that public buildings have to achieve already since 2019, the national to define the standard nearly zero energy standard. What does it mean in national level? But for public buildings, they have to achieve it since 2019, and private buildings have to achieve it since 2021. We have defined it within our national framework. I will mention it later on the next slides. For public buildings, and no. Please do not change the slide. Go one back, please. Yes, thank you. For public buildings, there's also defined a leading role. Since years, we have to fulfill this leading role in terms of energy efficiency and in terms of climate protection. In the Climate Protection Act is written down that the federal administration shall become climate neutral until 2030, until the time of the first milestone, including compensation measures. So it's allowed to implement compensation measures, but until 2045, we have to be climate neutral without any compensation measures. So that is a special challenge and special task for the federal administration. So yes, now the next slide, please. Okay, let's start to give you some background information to the Germany building sector. Mr. Schneider has already mentioned some numbers. Here you can see a graph about that. We have in Germany approximately 19 million residential buildings. Most of them are single family houses, followed by twin and terraced houses. That is a quite known number in terms of residential buildings. In terms of non-residential buildings, we only have in Germany rough estimations, but there's estimated that we do have 20 million, 20.5 million energy-related non-residential buildings. Some information more to the residential buildings. In these 19 million residential buildings, we have approximately 41 million dwelling units. There's a living space of in total 3.7 billion square meters. It means that a mean size of our dwellings units have 19 square meters and is used by two persons. That means that we have 45, 46 square meters per person in our dwellings, dwellings, that's it. And that is okay, but that value is increasing since decades, and that is a problem. So we are, on one hand, we are trying to reduce the energy demand of our buildings, and we are reducing also the specific energy demand of our buildings, so the kilowatt hours per square meter, but at the same time, we are using more and more and more of square meters, and that is a opposite development. We are, on one hand, we are decreasing the energy demand. On the other hand, we are increasing the used area in our dwellings. The mean floor space in non-residential buildings is given by 1,000 square meters approximately. As already mentioned by Mr. Schneider, approximately 40% of the total and final energy use in Germany is the building sector is responsible for it. And also approximately 40% of the total CO2 emissions in Germany are related to our building sector. It depends how you balance it. If you only take into account the energy and the emissions related to the energy used for heating processes in our buildings, so you will find the number of 14%. But if you take into account all the building and construction related emissions, you will have approximately 40% of the total CO2 emissions. The use of final energy and CO2 emissions in Germany is, if you divide it or if you bring a relation to the residential buildings or non-residential buildings, then you find 2/3 of the final energy use and CO2 emissions is related to the residential buildings. The rest is caused by the non-residential buildings. And one important information was already given by Mr. Schneider too. More than 66% of all buildings were erected before the first thermal insulation ordinance came into effect in 1977. So they were erected without any requirements in terms of energy efficiency or emissions. Our annual refurbishment rate, also a rough estimation, is approximately 1% per year. If you want to achieve our, and we have to achieve, but if we want to achieve our emission goals or objectives in terms of Climate Protection Act, we have to increase this number massively by factor 3, 4, something like that. So next slide, please. Thank you. Now, two slides to the legal framework to define energy requirements or energetic requirements to our buildings. We have in Germany the Building Energy Act, which came into effect in November 2020. This act has to be executed for residential and non-residential buildings. And unfortunately, I have to say personally, unfortunately, there was no tightening of the already existing energetic requirements. Later on, I will show you a historical view of the development of the tightening of the requirements to the building sector in Germany. But with the Building Energy Act, there was no tightening of the already existing energetic requirements. We have in that act are defined requirements to the energetic quality of the building envelope and the energy supply system. So these requirements you have to execute for new buildings and also in terms of refurbishments of existing buildings. Those requirements are, for instance, a requirement to the annual demand of primary energy, which can be used by the new buildings or the refurbished buildings. There are more requirements to the energetic performance of the building envelope or single parts of the building envelope, so the so-called U values of the walls, windows, the roof, and so on. And in the case you only make a change of the windows, you will find requirements to the new windows, energetic requirements to the new windows you put in. But there are some more requirements, for instance, set to the certification of the energy demand of or the energy consumption. We have two possibilities to certify the energetic quality of our buildings. One way is to certify the energy demand, the other one the energy consumption. And some other requirements mentioned there, for instance, to the thermal comfort in summertime. Next slide, please. Thank you. Furthermore, in the Building Energy Act, you will find requirements to the ecological quality of the heat supply system of our buildings. These requirements have to be executed for new buildings in general, but also for refurbishments of existing buildings in the public building sector. The requirements are as follows. You will find in the Act requirements to a certain coverage of the energy demand for heating and for cooling by using renewable energies. So you have to use renewable energies to cover your energy demand for heating and cooling. But the requirement is depending on the device you use. If you use solar thermal collectors to collect solar thermal energy to cover your heating demand, then you have to make sure that you will cover a minimum share of 15%. If you take a heat pump, you have to make sure that you will cover minimum share of 50%. So it depends on which device you are using for implementing renewable energies. And there's a link between the requirements to the ecological quality of the heat supply system and the energetic requirements I have introduced on the slide before. These requirements to the ecological quality of the heat supply system are fulfilled too if there's a certain undercut of the requirements to the energetic quality of the building envelope and the annual primary energy demand. So, and there's mentioned a special responsibility in the public building sector. Okay, then you please go forward. One more. Please one slide more and one slide more. Yes, so I will give you the promised picture to the historic development of the tightening of the requirements. As you can see here, you have on the x-axis the years, on the y-axis the primary energy demand for heating in kilowatt-hour per square meter in year. And you can see the horizontal, the blue lines, horizontal lines, which are marking the energetic requirements related to the thermal insulations or the energy saving ordinance, or meanwhile the BEA, Building Energy Act. And the yellow line is marking what at the same time what was reported by a research project or demo project, what was possible to reduce the energy demand. So in the build practice, you will find in between these lines. That is the existing energetic quality of the building stock in Germany. Okay, next slide, please. On the next slide, I will give you some more background information to the CO2 emissions in the German building sectors. That is a monitoring to the objectives of the Climate Protection Act. The baseline is 1990 in Germany with a CO2 emission in million tons 210, and until 2020 we have achieved a lot. We have reduced the CO2 emissions massively by 43%, which means 3 million tons per year of reduction. But unfortunately, we have not achieved the milestone 2020. There's a gap of 2 million tons, and that causes special action by the Federal Ministry for Building. They have to make sure with an action plan how to reduce the emissions in the building sector more to achieve the next milestone in 2030. In 2030, as already mentioned, 67 million tons are allowed to emit by the building sector. That means further reduction by 44% from 2020 to 2030. That means 5.3 million tons per year we have to reduce, a mean reduction until 2030. It is a huge, huge challenge in Germany to achieve that. For sure, we have to increase the refurbishment rate and the refurbishment efficiency. We have to change, make changes in the energy supply concepts, and we have to increase the use of renewable energies and digitalization. Next slide, please. Here's written on that slide is written what you will find some special projects in the coalition agreement, the actual one for the period 2021 to 2025. So I pick one out from that. We have to make sure that what we want to implement in our framework that every new installed heating device shall be operated with a share of renewable heat of minimum 65% from 2025. That is one project which will come in next or year 2023 or latest 2024. You will implement that. And also the energetic requirements to our buildings will be tightened much more. So from 2023, new buildings have to achieve a tightened standard. And from 2025, there is a foreseen a next tightening of that standard. And also the refurbished or the existing buildings, in case of refurbishment, have to fulfill a much higher standard, energetic standard after the refurbishment. Okay, next slide, please. Here are some pictures from best practice examples from federal buildings from the year 2005 to actual project one. I would like to highlight the third building, 2013, the Uber House 2019 in Berlin. That is the first climate neutral building for the purposes of the federal administration. That building is covering the total energy demand for the operation of the building by use of renewable energies. And the Uber in Dessau, the project or the building will go in operation next year in February is foreseen as a second climate neutral building for the purposes of the federal administration with a bigger size factor. Between both buildings are a factor 3. So the first building was 1,000 square meters, a very small one. The next project will have 3,000 square meters, so a bigger one. And it's quite a challenge to achieve the climate neutrality in that building. Okay, next slide. But also next slide, we will skip that to keep the time schedule. No, one back, please. Thank you. We speak about CO2 emissions, reduction of CO2 emissions, increasing the energy efficiency of our buildings, but I see lots of more challenges for the future, which we have to bring together. Energy efficiency is one point, it's an important point, but we also have to speak and think about the sustainability of our buildings and materials, the economic feasibility. We have to think about much more greening on our buildings. That is a point we are trying to implement also in the federal buildings. We are discussing strongly about a low-tech concept, so to reduce the number of technical equipment in the building, to make the operation of the building easier. And we don't have to forget the user satisfaction with in the new project. And also we have to take into account the market capacity. So we have enough challenges, so there's a lot to do. We have to find solutions for that. Okay, last slide, please. A short summary: we have already achieved a lot in Germany in terms of energy efficiency in the building sector. I think hopefully I could show it to you, but at the same time there's still a lot to do to achieve the future energetic aims for our buildings. An integral view on building technical equipment and site-located options is required. And last but not least, we have to find an optimal mix between security of energy supply, protection of the climate, and economic aspects. Thanks for your attention. Hopefully I do not crash the whole event.
Thank you, Ola, for a great overview and highlighting the direction Germany is moving in and the possibilities that the country has. We will now move on to our German companies who since the beginning of this week have been meeting with building efficiency stakeholders across the West Coast, learning just how much potential there is. But before that, I want to hand it over to Laura Scharlach, Senior Project Manager at RENAG, who will just say a few words about the German Energy Solution Initiative. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Cora. Yeah, I know we have a tough schedule today, so I just decided to skip my presentation because anyway, Cora and her team, they will send it over to you with a thank you mail. So of course, if you have any further questions, you can get back to me. My name is Laura Scharlach. I'm the head of the German Energy Solutions program within the Renewables Academy. We are based in Germany, in the capital of Berlin. I'm really happy to be here today. I was also listening to the introduction words by Mr. Potthoff and by the ambassador, and of course from my colleague Olaf Böttcher from Germany. Thank you very much for being here today. Yeah, the AHK definitely did a great job, and I'm very much looking forward to our German companies who will speak here today and on Thursday as well. And I will send you also some links in the chat because we also have a database with German companies, and you can subscribe for a newsletter. On the website of the German Energy Solutions Initiative, you will also find information like fact sheets and market analysis. So yeah, it's really worth to have a look on the website. And yeah, I will put the link in the chat now. Cora, I did pretty fast, like hopefully under 1 minute. And yeah, please feel free to reach out to me either today via the chat or via my email address. I'm happy to answer your questions and lead you to the right contact person also in the German ministry, or bring you together with German companies who are not here today. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward. And Cora, I give back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for this really quick presentation. We will now hear from Benedikt Heid, Sales Director of Engelmann Sensors. Benedikt, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning to the US. Good evening, meanwhile, to Germany. Happy to be here. Thanks to the GACC for setting this up and organizing this event. And I also tried to make up a little bit of the time, so we have more time to discuss and go into the panel discussion in a second. I wanted to raise one question, and that is, do you want to save energy, and why should we be doing that? A couple of remarks before we start. We have heard from the Council General that up to 40% of energy which is being spent is generated or is spent in buildings. So that is related to all buildings, be it residential or commercial or institutional buildings. And the use of energy has become more and more critical, not only because of the situation that we're in right now, which is extremely difficult and extremely critical, but it has become more and more critical over the last couple of years. This is why, and this is also what we just heard a couple of minutes back, more and more regulations have become into a place where the use of energy should be optimized in a way. And there's a lot of different aspects that you can look at. And one aspect that I would like to bring in is what we do and why we're doing that. We are a manufacturer of smart meters, which give you transparency about energy consumption. And we are talking about thermal energy consumption. And again, these 40% of energy that a human being spends, or the carbon footprint that a person generates, which is basically the same, these 40% accounting for thermal energy are basically related to what happens within a building. So most of the buildings are either heated or they are cooled by different kinds of systems. And there's different ways to monitor that and also to optimize that. The user behavior is very different. So you might have somebody in an apartment cooling down during summertime the apartment to a temperature, and then the neighbor does something very different at a very different temperature. And I give you just one number because we have heard so many numbers already today. If you reduce the temperature by 34 Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius, you change your energy consumption by 6%. That's quite a lot. And you can make this math up however you like. So again, 34 degrees Fahrenheit represents 6% more or less energy consumption. What you can do is that you can divide these energy costs in a building, either by the area or by the amount of people living in an apartment or the amount of people working in an office, or you can do that by consumption. This is our approach, and this is what we do or have been doing in Europe since more than 40 years. Meanwhile, with an efficiency gain of 15% per year, due to the pure fact that the costs are being allocated to the user, so to the ones who are really spending this energy. There's a couple of different drivers increasing also or giving more emphasis on this topic. One is, of course, environmental aspects. So it does make sense to reduce the carbon footprint, because at the end of the day, it's not only about the economics behind, but it's also about how sustainable we operate buildings and also how environmental friendly we are looking at these topics. Another one, and this is what we just heard in the previous presentation, there's a lot of regulatory requirements. So it is, if you have regulations in place, it's needed to comply with them. It's not, again, not only about the economics behind, but also. And then the next one, and this is then purely financially driven, and there's a lot of solution coming up in this field. This is incentives on energy efficiency, not only subsidies, but also how properties are valued, or how you could improve rental options on your properties. I give just one example, and that is about LEED certification. So if you have a building which has a higher LEED standard, that does increase the value of this property, or it could potentially bring in a higher rent income. And then last but not least, again, the cost aspect. I said it, and this is information or proven data that we have from more than 40 years of the use of smart meters on thermal energy applications. You do have up to 15% savings having this transparency. And what we do with our company is that we manufacture the meters which provide the data to have the transparency. And that is the base then to generate a business model, which is extremely appealing, and it cannot be more actual than it is right now. I am really looking forward to the discussions during this week and the individual meetings, and also having Axel Müller, who will be with me during this week as a partner for our discussions. Thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Benedikt. Next, we will hear from Christoph Schmidt, CEO at Global Assistant. Christoph, please share with us your presentation on how to build safe and self-sufficient homes.
Thank you very much for having me. And now comes from Felix. Thank you very much. That's me. My goal is taking care of people, homes, and heritage sites. So this is actually where we started, and thank you for having me here. To the land, California, where we started, and I like to make the bow to what has a heritage site like the Herodium project in the Holy Land to do with modern energy efficiency and high tech. Next slide. Or this one. It's actually how you see it here. You can do a lot of things if you found out what you can do on the most difficult side, like the Herodium, or in this case, a palazzo, where they digged out 1 lane wide, street wide, down 8 to 15 meters of or yards, you can say, just for making it worse. And then after we have been there for 3 days in training and showing them how to do it, the right pictures, these are the sites there 25 years later. Next slide, please. So how did we do that? We've done that with a very special tool, which is called the Drytronic. It's an electrochemical thing. I actually came from plasma physics and stuff like that. And it is able to move water from the one side to another side. I can actually direct it. So either it's a wall, a basement, a stone, whatever is conductive. We can move things from A to B. So this is designed really for a wide range of buildings. So of building something in and have it run forever. It can be used in combined materials and it's automatically. So you plug and play and run away basically. Next slide, please. And here's the principle. We go from the inside, we drill a hole like a thumb thick hole into the wall, put in an electrode like finger long, and then hook it up to the control system that does all the rest. It then drags or ionizes the water or contaminants, even the salts, and then pushes it where it came from. And that way, when it starts drying, we create a buffer zone, which is doing as if the wall was new in the end. Sort of, next slide. Here, because nobody wants to have mold and stuff like here, which was underneath like black in your basement or underneath your stairs. And actually on the right side, right hand down, you see some places where we put in already some electrodes. Sort of we plastered them in and hooked it up then later to a central point and then plastered all over and you don't see anything, which is so good because it controls the moisture, kills the mold, and you're done. Next thing. This is for people that, just to show that in the normal way, you invest a lot in buildings, you do replastering, retrofitting, whatever, and you invest a lot and it costs a lot. And I just want to be a price breaker by putting that at least in half over the long run. So if the ROI is normally about 4 or 5 years, in most cases, sort of when you have a dry home, it has more value than a wet home. You cannot even sell a wet home. It's dangerous, as the previous slide showed off, because a moldy house is a bad house. A dry, bone dry health is a healthy and a better one for everybody, which gives us some advantage points to everything else, for we are actually the only one on the planet with doing that. Next slide, please. And then we come up, because I think everybody wants to have a really dry, sunny, automatically resilient, working resilient house that is in this case really covering everything you need in California or in the West Coast, which I was inspired when I studied there in the late 80s in Santa Clara. So it was great coming back here, even now virtually. This house, for example, is also inspired by the Near East, with these wind towers, or what you have in California or nearby, New Mexico and Nevada and stuff like, with the adobe houses or the buildings there that have this wind or this going in wind from underneath and moving upwards, which can also be used for non-climatic systems. Sort of a natural wind tower makes the air conditioning obsolete. So with 42 degrees, that's 100 and something, 10 something Fahrenheit, we were able to maintain a normal condition this summer, for example, and many summers before, without actually having any problems or just by opening doors, making some shading on the outside, and that's about it. So it's a very natural thing. And now thank you very much. And I hope we can exchange and you have a lot of questions to me later on in the chat or personally on the phone, whatever. And looking forward to engaging with you and having things to do in common by then.
Thank you, Christoph. Now it's time for our panel discussion, which will delve deeper into the topic of energy efficiency for all communities and how the clean energy transition can benefit all communities and not just affluent ones in order to be successful on a large scale. The panel will be moderated by Colin Mangham, director of the Net Zero Escalator at the US Green Building Council LA. With the Net Zero Escalator, he guides startups speeding the commercialization of clean tech innovation to achieve net zero energy, water, carbon, and waste. His Find Your Woods TEDx and appearance on CNN's Going Green has helped establish him as an internationally recognized voice for life-inspiring innovation. Colin, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Just a quick tech check.
Yes,
good.
We can hear you.
Because I have to share something. So I'm in not my usual speaking environment. You can see I'm actually in my car, a hybrid vehicle, parked across from an EV charging. Apparently, in this carport that has 2,000 spaces, there's one EV charger, and it says out of order. And so this is just the state of affairs here. But the reason I'm doing this from my car is I'm actually at the Renewable Energy Plus, RE Plus big conventions once a year for solar, for battery storage, et cetera. And it's a big event for our community here in Los Angeles and the United States. And I really thought that there would be better Wi-Fi reception. I thought there'd be car charging, et cetera. And so clearly we have some work to do on infrastructure. Maybe I have some work to do on planning. So it's a little bit dark here where I am, but the focus, of course, will be on our speakers, our panelists, and it's great to see some familiar faces, by the way. So so jumping into it, I do want to thank you all for having me here, especially in these circumstances. I am the director of the Net Zero Accelerator, and that's with USGBC-LA. We're the only accelerator of our kind focused on net zero energy, water, waste, and carbon. And so what we do now with 70 different companies is we're working with really early stage technologies, not incubation companies, not super early startups, but startups that have growth stage technologies that have prototypes that communities like ours can help to de-risk these things, to test and to refine these things, and to give them the opportunity to be better at what they do, to validate what they do, and then bring it to scaled adoption is a lot of what we do here. So that's exciting. That's my perspective. And a lot of why I do this work. I'm actually, my main job is as a co-founder of a renewable energy startup myself, Morpho Energy, and we do commercial industrial rooftop solar projects. So we're unlocking the idle assets we see as all these rooftop spaces that could be renewable energy plants, right? That's my main job, but I do this partly because I get to have these discussions. So I'm really excited to hear from everyone here. I will also mention that I'm a guest lecturer, actually a visiting faculty for Reutlingen University. And so I will be there in Reutlingen, flying into Stuttgart in October. And then I will also then be to Helsinki and Reykjavik, where I first met. I'm bringing this around to a story here, but I first met my friends at Reutlingen at the Charge Energy Branding Conference in Reykjavik in 2019. And I mentioned that because one of the key things that I learned at that conference, and so much so that I took pictures of it and I showed it to other people, was there was a speaker who showed a slide that said, what is our best source of energy? Our best new source of energy, and asked, is it geothermal like you have in Iceland, or is it wind, is it solar, is it hydro? And the answer was none of the above. It was efficiency. So thinking about efficiency, thinking about not megawatts, but megawatts, you know, how do we just treat efficiency, energy efficiency, and measure it and advocate it and educate around it as a function of, you know, just treating it like energy that it is. Energy saved is energy not consumed, right? And so I also want to mention, and then I'm going to bring this to our panelists, that I was actually trained not in any of these sectors, not in architecture, as we have here, or engineering, or sustainable business development, et cetera. I was trained in branding and marketing. And one of my first clients in 1997 was the Environmental Protection Agency for the United States. And we had a campaign called the High Performance Home. And in 1997, some of the things were like, take your food, and before you put your warm food, your leftovers in a container, but let them cool on the countertop before you put them in the refrigerator. That was kind of our efficiency measures, right? But I mentioned it because a lot of what we advocated then, we still haven't achieved now, 25 years ago. So there is work to be done. We have this wonderful forum and people that are sharing, especially across cultures and borders, to discuss how we can together innovate and share our insights into how to best get there, how to accelerate all this. And so with that, I want to bring this around to our panelists. And I'm a big believer in letting the panelists explain who they are and what they do in the context of the questions that we'll go through. We have a number of them to talk about here relative to the topic, especially around affordable housing, underserved communities, marginalized, less affluent communities that can't necessarily afford these technologies. So what I want to do is go around the room and begin. I think we'll just do this probably alphabetical, but let each of you, David and Sarah and Heather, and also Almudena. I just want to make sure I said it right. Good to see you. I know all the others from USGBCLA, so good to meet you. Sorry for the hesitation there. So anyway, I would like to great. So I want to go around the room and basically say, all right, give me some context on what you do that's important to this conversation, and also what are the most pressing issues you see relative to, how do communities that are underserved, that are underrepresented, that don't have the money to spend on the most efficient electric appliances or move off of gas appliances, right? Like we're doing in Germany and somewhat here, right? But if we can go around the room and begin with David, tell us, David, about some of what you're doing with LA BBC and how this is important. What are communities doing out there that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity. And this is an awesome panel. It's great to see so many friends on here. So the LA Better Buildings Challenge is a utility funded initiative to really work upstream with customers to originate projects that ultimately will result in incentive applications. And that doesn't just help the economics of the projects, it also helps to be able to count the savings, right, towards the utilities goals and the city's citywide sustainability targets, with a major equity lens on all of that. We collaborate with Sarah's firm and others to really focus on affordable multifamily. That's been a pillar of our program for about 6 or 7 years now. We've been doing this since 2011, so quite a while. It's a lot about not just decarbonization, but cost, right? Saving money, and how do we get engagement with folks that first and foremost are concerned about cost. That's what they feel in their day-to-day lives. So I'll stop there.
Great. Maybe Almudena?
Great. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for the organization. And I'm really honored about the people who I get to share the panel with, and very glad to meet you all. So I am Almudena. I am a researcher. So I think I'm representing a completely different side of the coin in this conversation, which is always good and interesting. I am a researcher at the ISS, Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. Right now, my research is more focused on hydrogen, but previous doing that, I was focused on social performance of renewable energy projects. I did a research project focusing on how to increase the social performance of renewable energy projects in Mexico, gathering some interviews and findings that I think that could be very interesting for this conversation, especially to bring by the sustainability aspect of it, right? I mean, I guess today we have been talking a lot about costs, a lot about figures, a lot about the technology and innovation curve, but there's also the other aspect that we need to address, right? It's not only about providing funding or providing the alternative so that families can afford having a good innovation system in their homes to be more efficient, but it's also about increasing the sustainability aspect of it, right? It's not only wondering about does a house has access to electricity, how much energy does that house can have? Is it an energy that only allows them to turn the light on, or is it an energy that also allows them to turn their fridges on, to have access to television, to radio, because that also leads you to other things that the communities need. So it's not only about being able to turn the light on, but about other aspects of sustainability that we need to address. But I guess I'm gonna stop it there so we can develop further on this as we move on the conversation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I'd like to go to Sarah and then to Heather.
Hi, my name is Sarah Hill. I'm the Director of Low-Income Programs at the Association for Energy Affordability. We're located in California, although our headquarters is actually in New York City. And what I do at AEA is run the low-income program wing. And so we work specifically in energy efficiency and renewable energy programs for multifamily affordable housing. And so I run $1.1 billion worth of both state and utility funding to get that money into existing multifamily buildings to help them retrofit those buildings so that they're prepared for the clean energy future. And so my background's in architecture. I'm very, very passionate both about environmentalism as well as serving the 99% of our population that can't afford architecture and ensuring that we all have equitable access to clean energy.
Love it. Thank you, Sarah. And Heather?
Great, thank you. So good to be here with all of you. I'm Heather Rosenberg with Arup. Arup is a global engineering consulting planning firm, actually headquartered in London. We have 3 offices in Germany, in Berlin, Dusseldorf, and Frankfurt. So, but most of my work is focused in LA. I am the resilience leader for the Americas, for resilience as a discipline. And we take a very integrated approach to that. So most of my work right now has been focused on cities, and particularly in Southern California, looking at the nexus of decarbonization, resilience, and equity, and thinking about decarbonization both as an essential climate mitigation measure we absolutely have to move forward with, and a disruptive change for a lot of people and a lot of households. There are estimates that in order to meet California's decarbonization goals, we need to have 70% of our building stocks all electric for space and water heating by 2045. Most of those buildings are already built, so we're not going to get there just with new construction. That means we need to touch a lot of existing buildings. At the same time, we have a housing crisis and a shortage of housing and an housing affordability crisis. We have a lot of unhoused people. And it's important to look not just at, how do we physically decarbonize the building, but which buildings and what does it mean for people? And by increasing the cost or otherwise disrupting households, are you actually, what is the potential for that you could displace people and who have nowhere else to go? And digging back behind that, what is the reason why we have communities that chronically don't receive these kinds of investments? Why do energy programs not necessarily serve multifamily housing or low-income communities or affordable housing? And how do we reverse those patterns? How do we look at those communities that are already on the front lines of climate change, that already are most exposed to extreme heat, extreme cold, to disruptions in supply chains, to all of these other impacts and COVID, and have nowhere else to go perhaps, and flip it and look at those are buildings that might not otherwise change unless we create new mechanisms. So how do we start with those buildings that are hardest and create a business case for doing that in ways that protect existing communities and bring those benefits to existing communities as a way to actually support bottom-up market transformation, which helps everybody. So I'll stop there.
Got it. And maybe just to add on to that, and then I have a question for Amadena. what are the key drivers? Could you bullet point for us the drivers to, if it's structural, if it's social, what's actually causing this to repeat itself?
Well, thank you very much. I think this is a very interesting aspect to address. I think the most important driver is to actually include the communities. Sometimes most of the project assess the impact on the communities after the project was implemented and not before. And I mean, there are many countries that are already implementing consultation processes like prior allowing a project to be built or allowing like a permission and so on. But it has to go beyond that. It has to really include the communities throughout all the process. And my research showed that if projects do this, they can increase the social performance of a renewable energy project. One of the projects that I was looking at was a community-owned solar PV project in the state of Hidalgo, a very small community that didn't have access to electricity. A government funding program granted them the solar panels, but it was not only about granting the panel, installing the panel. Throughout all the process, the community was involved. They were asked, okay, why do you need electricity? For what do you use electricity? And it's not only about turning the light on, like I mentioned previously. For them, having electricity also means security, also means that they could leave the light on at night. That would avoid animals to come to their houses that really affected their security, and also stopped robberies to happen. It also involved the communities in the way of explaining them what is a solar panel and why is a solar panel important for you. Again, not only about having electricity, but also about your impact in the whole energy transition. And after that, the communities understood better what climate change is, and most importantly, what they can do to address it. And I think this part about really empowering the communities is key. That should be one of the key drivers in the implementation of all new projects if we really want to move forward, especially in a framework that, like I said previously, these positive effects that community can have is not a byproduct of the project, but it's actually one of the core values of the implementation of a project.
Thank you. And so it's interesting to think about some of these communities, as we well know, and I work quite a bit, and you've probably seen South Central Los Angeles in movies, right? But I spent a lot of time there in South LA, and a lot of them are just trying to get through the week, if not the day. So are they thinking about climate action, And so with that, I'm curious, even like, so David, what are you seeing out there in terms of like initiatives on the ground or in fact, policies that can help to ensure that these things are available and these things are advocated and even subsidized?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to underline something Almudena said about engaging the community. What do they want, right? What are they curious about? What are they afraid of? And letting that inform the program and the project, right? And that's the approach that we've been taking here in LA as we work with a cohort of affordable housing developers to understand what's it going to take to get them interested in decarbonization. And these are smaller owners, not the big well-known names. And one of the things we're learning is, to your point, Colin, basic habitability, basic safety, basic health is the first step to unlocking, right, a conversation about decarb, and it's about saving money as part of that. And so, a big part of our work is also around financing and how do we start to assign economic value to health and social outcomes that result, because those ideas really do resonate. But if we come in saying, I'm going to put in a heat pump and I'm going to ignore, the lead-based paint and asbestos, that doesn't go well, or the glaring sort of issues that they have. And so it's really important, we're finding, to wrap this like very technical conversation with something that's a lot more human and a lot more near term. So to quickly respond on the policy side, LA is moving forward with a building performance standard, and doing a lot of stakeholder engagement around that. And Heather can probably speak to that. She's been leading a lot of that work. And just this week introduced a motion, which is like the beginnings of a local law around a cooling standard, because the vast majority of low-income residents in LA don't have air conditioning, and extreme heat is the #1 public health risk that we face. And you all know about the poor air. Well, it's heat is the issue. And how do we do all this when our grid is already maxed out? And that was already, all over the paper, the heat wave that we've been experiencing. So how do we electrify while at the same time, getting at these equity issues, and what's the support that's needed there?
Yeah, I want to put it out in the room too, that it's interesting to think about the externalities we talk about, that if there's a public health risk because someone can't cool their home and they end up in a hospital with heat stroke, that puts costs into the system. Why can't we move the expenses we're paying for that, to the street level? And maybe someone can speak to that. Heather, actually, I'd love to hear what you experienced in LA, and then Sarah, on the larger scale of California, what can we share back with our German counterparts?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, we've been doing quite a bit of stakeholder engagement in partnership with the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a major environmental group focused on decarbonization, and with the Los Angeles Housing Department and a lot of other organizations, and really trying to hear what people care about and what they're concerned about. We're also doing a lot of related work in San Diego, with some of the community choice aggregator that Craig Perkins talked about. And when we go out to communities, first of all, what we're hearing is people really are concerned about climate change. They understand the impacts of climate change, and this is particularly focused on hard to reach communities and affordable housing populations and others. They understand the benefits of energy efficiency and the associated benefits of air quality and why they want this. But on their list of things they're concerned about right now, just like what David was saying, if you go in and talk about heat pumps and you've got mold and asbestos and can't pay your energy bill, it's a problem. And so we are hearing that very clearly. So I think part of it is designing those policies. Decarbonization ordinances are being developed in both the city of LA and LA County, have to take into account renters. They have to take into account low-income communities in particular, and small businesses and others, and be designed for that. And there is a business case for doing that. We are working with a lot of different organizations to create new models to think about benefit cost analysis, and calculate that, because from an investment perspective, if you're thinking about public dollars, keeping people housed, keeping people safe, and reducing emissions all have specific public benefits that you can quantify, which relate to keeping people out of emergency rooms, keeping people out of the social support system. And I should say that our social support systems in the US are quite different than they are in Europe. We have very little public housing in Los Angeles. We don't have public health care. We have, just a very different kind of social safety net that's sort of left out to the private sector. And so there is a case to be made, but in some ways it's harder to make it here in terms of investment in public dollars, because it isn't the public who's holding the bag necessarily. But we are making it and thinking about a lot of different models for calculating those benefits for public investment as well as for private investment, for different, ways of aggregating funds into some kind of investable vehicle that goes from big capital to individual projects that can be implemented, and really bring benefits to communities in models that are less extractive, as well as models that keep those benefits within the community. So a lot to do there, a lot of work, but a lot of work is also happening.
And thank you. So maybe Sarah, can you build upon that? Because you're Northern California and maybe thinking about the whole state as well. But given what Heather just shared regarding Los Angeles, do you see things differently, similarly? What are the differences here?
Similarly, and I think that, from a statewide perspective, a couple of things to sort of add on to that. you know, from an initiative standpoint, where we're seeing this going, or where we're seeing the need, and now sort of the programs and services that are responsive to that need are really around not only whole building offerings for these low-income multifamily existing buildings to help them decarbonize sooner than later, because as we know, that's a large piece of the pie that we need to hit first. And we know that this affordable housing tends to be an older building stock. And because of the energy burden of the low-income community, that tends to show us that those buildings are inefficient and those residents need this the most. And so that's really the place of need and urgency where we can really start. So number one, not just decarbonizing these buildings, which is a lot harder than it sounds, it's extremely challenging. But as a second wave initiative, if we can't decarbonize now, starting to do electrification ready buildings. In other words, to get the plugs in place so that if we do have gas equipment in certain areas, that there's a plug available so that when that equipment dies, it is ready to go to switch to electric equipment right off the bat. And that's one of those hurdles that you'll find we don't think about in advance, right? We don't think about how we can change because this equipment's going to last for 25 years. So the better we can prepare the building's infrastructure for the eventual electrification now, that is a good investment for the future of electrification and decarbonization in the state of California. So that's sort of where we're beginning to see us going. The other thing I wanted to point out in terms of statewide initiatives that I think has been really impactful is the disadvantaged communities map that the state of California does. And that's basically a map that shows us where the pollution burden is most. And California has used this map as a tool to indicate where we systemically underinvested our time and where we over-polluted over the course of time. And some of the public funding is set aside to go specifically back and reinvest back into these disadvantaged communities that have had an overburden of pollution. And I think this is one of the initiatives that I just wanted to applaud California for doing, because as we know, we can't reach equity with equitable amounts of investment. It needs to be a higher level of investment in areas where we've systemically underinvested. And that's what we're beginning to see from our policymakers in setting aside and carving out dollars to specifically go back into communities that we know are those that are plagued the most.
And and thank you. So I'm thinking about, well, what do we invest in then? And what are those, what would be the leverage points for action? And we've talked about a little bit like preparedness, readiness of long-term infrastructure. So when it's time, we're good to go, but we should also think about what can we do today, tomorrow, next week as well. And maybe Almudena, if you could share with us, what is the number one short-term action you would see we would need to invest in these communities, and what would be your number one long-term action, like Sarah mentioned, like just making sure that the plugs are there and available?
Okay, well, this is definitely, I think, one of the hardest questions to answer, right? I mean, I guess like in the field of research, that is the question that we're all working on right now. But I mean, this question also depends on very specific situation, right? I mean, we have to assess the level of energy poverty in specific situations. We have to assess the level of electricity access and then go from there. But then again, this cannot be decided as a way of like one size fits all. This has to be decided addressing the communities directly, right? I think that would be like the first short-term action to take. Really go specific into which are the communities that are most in need. Go to them, speak to them, involve them in the process, and let them also speak. Let them tell you, okay, our electricity needs go beyond having the light on, go beyond, or maybe not even the light on. Maybe it's also terms of cooling and heating. I mean, I'm also talking to you all, also sorry, that's why I'm dark, but we are in Germany. You know that we really have to be very energy efficient at this moment. So in all the sustainability institutes, we have been instructed to take care of the light, take care of the heating. So it's also very, very cold, but we're we're keeping on. But maybe those are the needs of those communities, right? And then in the long term, implement these projects that are kind of like more one size fits all, you know, like more electrification, more connected systems, but after assessing the needs of the communities. So I guess that can kind of respond the very hard answer, but I would definitely go from there. The first process is always go to the communities, involve them, listen to them, and you can always be surprised by the answers. They can really tell you where to go, and following that lead, you won't get it wrong.
I like that a lot. We talk about feedback loops, and we talk about town hall meetings, and certainly stakeholder engagement and ground truthing, right, that we do here. So those are all important things as well. And I think maybe with that in mind, and bring it back to Los Angeles here, I'd love to hear from David and Heather regarding, you know, what is the benefit to cities and governments to think about this, or know more about this, or act on this, or even communicate it? Like I'm a branding person, so what is the goodwill aspect of it? You know, what are the benefits? Not just cost benefits, but certainly if that's the core of it, let's talk about it. But what do you both think about that relative to Los Angeles and where we live here?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Heather respond on that specific question, but I just wanted to make a point building on Almedina's piece and the question about near term, you know, because there is a lot of stakeholder engagement going on there. There has been, but I'm interested what Heather and others think. And I think people get frustrated when they feel like that doesn't go anywhere, or where, you know, the supporting infrastructure to actually move on ideas that come out of that isn't there. And so, you know, I think, like Sarah talked about, electrification ready buildings. I think there's like decarbonization ready city government and utilities, right, is something that doesn't really get talked about. And I don't want to get in trouble with my colleagues at the city, but, you know, I'm very candid. I think they appreciate that about me. So, you know, rate reform, you know, incentives, getting those in place. You know, we finally have one, which Sarah's firm is really leading, but it took years of lobbying to get that. It was a huge gap in the market. You know, we've been working on this, all of us, for a long time, and there were literally no dedicated incentives until just this June, which is kind of crazy. And then as we start to talk about, you know, operationalizing all of this, and we've got city council passing motions, as I mentioned, they don't have the administrative capacity to do all of the inspections and panel upgrades and, you know, temporary relocation assistance, which is necessary if you're doing a deep retrofit. So, you know, I think communities would appreciate if cities and utilities did more homework and more like introspection about how are they prepared, right? How is the city and the utilities prepared at that level, right? If people say, hey, yes, I'm here, I want to do it. So I just think that's an important step that doesn't get talked about enough.
I'll jump in. I'm laughing because, you know, when I was thinking about when you asked Alameda, what is the one thing you would do right now? And the first thing I would do would be look at government structures for delivering these programs with government and utility and collaboration between and engaging partnerships, but really looking internally. And that's a lot of the work we're doing within San Diego County and elsewhere, is really looking at how are decisions getting made? How are programs being implemented? How are you working? Because suddenly you need the housing department and the utility and the building department all to be working together. And that's one of the biggest barriers, is those administrative and process pieces. So I think that's a really big piece. In terms of what are the benefits, I mean, there are societal benefits, and then some can be monetized and some are much more difficult to monetize. You know, the first I talked about, you know, reduced pressure on emergency rooms and the emergency support system during extreme events, but also during normal times, if people are using decarbonization interventions as a way to push people out of housing, you know, then we need to combine these things. I think what I would say is when we look at, if we look at just decarbonization and we try and solve that, we could come up with some pretty good solutions for existing buildings. And what you will have if you look that way is a whole bunch of unintended consequences related to displacement and housing affordability and other issues. If you look just at housing protections and try and protect low-income communities and low-income households from displacement, and say, we're not going to require these populations to participate in decarbonization, they're exempt, you actually have even worse knock-on problems. And that can come from, you know, as we move off the natural gas infrastructure, for example, who's left holding the bag? And if it's poor communities and poor households that are the only, and small businesses are the only ones left connected to the natural gas grid, maintenance for that infrastructure gets shifted to a smaller and smaller pool and becomes more and more expensive, and also leaves whole populations as stranded assets. And that is not an acceptable outcome of this. So we need to think about who holds the burden for that infrastructure. The other piece, I think, is that we have these older buildings that have this whole long backlogs of deferred maintenance. And so providing holistic deep energy retrofits that also are resilience retrofits. So looking at, you know, once you're intervening in a building and you're doing the heat pump or the weatherization or whatever it is you're doing, and also do the asbestos and the mold and the, you know, and a piece of it is, how do we just get some of these buildings up to code? So, you know, we like to talk about the REACH codes. We like to talk about what can be done beyond, but how do we get them to sort of, you know, good operating condition in a way that keeps people safe, that potentially adds cooling, with a heat pump, you have that piece. That's a more technical conversation, but that is a real value. So all of these things are interconnected. It's easy to get overwhelmed and to get to paralysis by analysis, right? But at the end of the day, I think Alumena's point about engaging with communities, bringing whole packages and sort of one-stop shop kind of interventions that do the whole thing at once with strong renter protections, and at the same time rethinking organizational processes to enable our institutions to deliver those benefits. I mean, just like we can talk about cascading unintended consequences, we also can talk about maximizing co-benefits. And so when we think in a systems-based approach, how do you maximize those co-benefits? How do you calculate them? How do you justify them? How do you create, you know, all the different tools that are needed there?
Love it. And I think this is, you know, this is all just kind of washing over me, and so many insights. I want to watch this again afterwards so I can actually put it all together. But what I'm realizing is we're giving a lot of insights from where we are and sharing them out back to our German and other colleagues. But I wonder if anyone, and maybe I'll start with Sarah and then over to Almudena, but what are we learning from other countries? What are you seeing as well? And I believe, Sarah, you have maybe an anecdote, at least from a European country, or something you'd like to share regarding affordable housing.
Well, I can't say that I'm an expert on European affordable housing by any stretch of the imagination. However, I do remember back when I was in grad school in 2006, I'm aging myself now, you know, I did learn way back then, you know, that in the Netherlands, there was some social housing, some affordable housing that was public, that the country itself was putting out to bid, and that the requirements just from a very base level was that the residents of the building had zero energy bills. And so just to submit a design for this public housing, it had to meet those requirements. And I just took that with me throughout my entire career and thought, wow, back in the 2000s, this was such a smart idea. Why are we not doing this? And it was something that I always thought we could easily implement something like this into our low-income housing tax credit requirements right off the bat. And why aren't we? So that was just a very small anecdote that I thought was pretty progressive, and I'm sure it's only gotten better in many ways that I'm not aware.
Well, then I guess I'll jump into that. I mean, I'm also not an expert at all, but I think I can kind of share a little bit of like what Germany is doing. I won't go that much into detail as I had prepared, because the previous speakers really provide like a very good framework of what is happening in Germany on those terms. But Germany has like this, you know, like basic framework of 4 things that the government is doing, you know, to implement this more sustainable and energy efficient housing. So there's abolishment of tax measure. This one is very new. So there was like this tax measure that people had to pay for these renewable energies. And now that tax was finally abolished by a law this year. Then we have 2 very big funding measures to fund these programs for it's both new buildings to be constructed in a more energy efficient manner, but also to support mechanisms to make old buildings more energy efficient. That is also one of the most important ones. And then we also have a stronger implementation of efficiency standards, and of course the subsidies for low income housing. But now, I mean, like I mentioned before, since the previous speakers had already touched on that, I just want to talk about something that is important in light of the events that we're living through right now, and that is the Russian invasion to Ukraine, right? I mean, we know that that is posing one of the biggest threats into the European energy system, and especially into the German energy system. And here, the energy efficiency and especially the support for low-income housing is so important that the measures that are going to be taken now is that the priority for, let's say, the actors or the entities that are going to have the access to energy throughout the winter are going to be the housing, not the industries, as one should mention, but it's the housing. You know, being in conversation and at different forums with people, both from the government and also from the private sector and other types of organizations, there in Germany and in Europe in general, the view is always the most important thing is that the heat and the light does not turn off in European houses, in German houses. What happens outside is something that we're going to have to deal with, but the most important part is that. So I think that is a very important lesson to draw on, that we have to keep the people at the center, right? And it's not only about implementing more technological and more innovative measures, but also keeping the people at the center, building those policies, those funding mechanisms, those frameworks, because if that part of the economy is active and is thriving, then the whole system can also work. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. Like I mentioned, going into detail about these other measures, but especially due to what we're living right now, that it's an important lesson and just like a story to keep in mind for the future.
Colin, I have one more quick anecdote about something that we are actually actively borrowing from Europe right now. We have a research and design project that is borrowing a technology out of Europe. It's actually out of the Netherlands, but they are implementing it on affordable housing in Germany specifically as well. It's called Energy Sprung, but it is a panelized system for the exterior of the building that can help retrofit existing buildings into net zero buildings from the outside, 10 days or less, and without moving residents out. And so it's a very interesting new technology that can help take existing buildings of all shapes and sizes and scale them to retrofit faster. And that's an exciting technology to mention here because we're excited about the scalability. One of the challenges that we're seeing in this market is it takes a lot of technical assistance from our team of experts to do this statewide. And so that's the limitation right now, is that we just need a lot of people who know what they're doing. And so the finding ways in which we can scale this faster and do more is extremely important. So that technology out of Europe is exciting, and we're excited to learn a little bit more about it and put it into implementation here.
One other, can I jump in? Sorry, just have one story that I was that we're looking at as well, not just on the decarbonization side, but the way that we think about affordable housing. You know, here it is thought about as an asset and with a sort of external investors trying to make a profit, as opposed to thinking about it as a social infrastructure. And we're looking at models like in Austria, in Vienna, models of affordable housing that are provided as social infrastructure, that they're publicly funded and they're affordable and they're desirable, and not thinking about these things as slums. And part of that is sort of, we have to, at least what that would look like here in the US, and part of the process of community engagement for us, what that would mean would be rethinking what is infrastructure, and why are there communities that are left out, and that brings us a lot of questions around sort of legacy of racism and redlining, and why these communities have happened in this way, and a lot of judgments and assumptions that people have about these populations. But if we could start to think more systemically about housing as a service, about housing as infrastructure, and who deserves housing, that everybody deserves housing, that housing is a human right, then models like the Vienna model start to make a lot more sense here.
And I think a lot of that modeling and certainly a whole systems approach is a lot of what we do, certainly, and back to Sarah's point about, how do we, scale the adoption, right? And I'll just share my one kind of anecdote from having taught German students at Reutlingen and MBA programs is a lot of times I will hear from them that you American entrepreneurs just jump in and you have no fear, and I can't do that. There's so many risks, and I say, well, that's perfect then, because entrepreneurship and scaling these things is about calculated risks. It's about mitigating risks, reducing risk, and if you are risk averse, you're in a great position to figure out how to make these things happen at speed and at scale. So with that said, I also want to think about, well, what does that roadmap look like? And maybe David, if you could speak to where does it start, and what are the inflection points? What are the milestones? What are the stop-offs along the way? If we were to say quickly, what does a roadmap look like from where we are to where we need to be at least in the near term?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think back to the point about, city capacity, right? That there really is a next step from the types of stakeholder conversations. Community engagement is really key. So I wanted to underline that. And we talked also about, before and after measurement. And I wanted to add to Heather's list of housing as healthcare is a theme, that we're really exploring. And as part of the projects that we're developing with Sarah's team, we're working to get some funding to install sensors that will measure the indoor environmental quality, that will measure the differential between indoor and outdoor temperature before and after the projects. And there's some tools, they're in development. The US EPA has one that we were able to kind of hack to work to be able to make some projections. It's not really designed for project level projections, but there's another one coming out of Harvard that is. And so we'll be using that to track, along with some surveys, some occupant surveys, and feedback to the residents about, what is your current indoor environmental quality? What is the temperature differential before and after? To really link for people. I think, few people would disagree, right, that there's a linkage there, but it hasn't been measured, right? And to start really in a credible, scientific way, assigning economic value to the health and social outcomes as measured by, right, emergency room visits, asthma attacks, all of these things that really do affect people's productivity, whether that's in school or at work, and our hypothesis is that this starts to open up the opportunity for new sources of capital to start participating in retrofit projects, meaning healthcare systems themselves starting to allocate capital because they're avoiding costs that they'll otherwise have to absorb when they have lots of uninsured or underinsured people showing up because of complications from extreme heat and gas leaks, mold, the list. So I think that kind of research is important. We're not the only ones doing it, which is a good thing. But really, understanding that, and then also the point about, rehabilitation, modernization, just habitability as a stepping stone, and getting to, electrification ready or decarb ready, and quantifying that need as well, because that's another area that's going to require subsidy. And, as Sarah and others are acutely aware, the utilities can't incentivize rehab work. They can only incentivize the energy stuff and the water stuff. And so, that need remains. And so how can we, take an integrated approach that with financing and incentives and supporting services and policies and the ability to implement those policies. But I think we've got, some foundation building to do before we can really, show people a credible path forward.
That's great. And I think I'm just looking at time. We're coming up on time. Can you believe it? I mean, each one of these questions, we could have an hour-long discussion, right? What I'd like to do actually is try something a little bit different. If you just join me in this, is for each of you to think about, and I'll even lead, to think about a person. I mean, we're talking about stakeholder engagement throughout this conversation. We're talking about communities we want to serve. Is there a person? And if you know a person, if you can see a face, if you want to name a name of someone that you want to pledge, that you want to change their world as best you can, how would you say that here in this room? And I'll say, for example, my colleague Jasmine, with a group called Physicians for Social Responsibility in South LA, doing amazing work. I would say to Jasmine, I would love for us all to find more economically viable ways for them to adopt these technologies and to implement these things so that they can, in fact, and she can, better enjoy the lifestyle she should be able to enjoy. That's what I would like for Jasmine. Who would like to take that interesting question? Amadina?
Yeah, I guess I'll take on that question. I mean, it's one of my favorite questions. And here, I'm not just thinking about one person, but I'm thinking about a community. I'm thinking about a special community in Oaxaca that is like very far away from the capitals or from Oaxaca City that do not have electricity access. And we know that having, for example, a solar PV panel in their houses would change their life completely, not only because of having the light on, because it would also mean, and here I would like to connect to something that Heather kept on saying that really stayed in my mind, thinking about this also about a health issue, like not only about energy issue, but a health issue. Having a solar PV panel that can also power your home means that you don't have to cook your food with wood that also harms your lungs, or having to do your homework with the candlelight, but with a better electricity systems that won't harm your eyes. Being able to do other things at night, being able to engage with your community members, having a night together because you have the light to do that, having the insurance that you're going to be safe at night because you have a system that protects your home. That is what I would put my hopes for, that everything that we're doing in all the aspects that we're doing it, we can reach these goals for everyone.
Love it. Thank you. Who wants to jump for that? Heather?
Well, yeah, I'm thinking in particular of a woman who we did some stakeholder engagement around home health care workers a while back with Emerald Cities, looking at how are home health care workers actually deliverers of resilience into the places that they work. And I remember a woman actually lived in Ventura County with her adult son, who required was immobilized, paralyzed, I believe, from the waist down, and required a ventilator to breathe whenever he was asleep. He could breathe when he was awake, but if he fell asleep, he needed the ventilator. And there was a fire, and he's 200 pounds, and she's a small woman. She couldn't evacuate. She didn't have people to call. They have a small backup generator, but it wasn't enough. And so she had to stay awake with him for a 24-hour period, waking him up every 2 minutes to make sure that he could breathe so that she could keep him alive. And so it just stresses to me that energy issues are health issues. They are community issues. They are life and death for a lot of people, and that it's rethinking what is a home, what is a building, what is a community, what is energy, what is it for, how do we deliver it, how do we deliver it in normal times, how do we deliver it in times of disruption, how do we support through different types of networks, ways of making sure that people stay healthy and protected, and what does that look like, and how do we build that into the energy system. And it's not that we need the same answer in every home or the same level of energy resilience, but we do need to be thinking about equity, resilience, and decarbonization together as 3 linked goals. We can't meet one at a time, we need to do them all together.
And just to piggyback on that, and it's part and parcel with public safety. When we get towards these climate events, it becomes a public safety issue, and just to acknowledge that and to invest in it appropriately is really sort of the next stage.
Sarah, do you have a person you're imagining?
Many people that I'm imagining. I could go on forever, but unfortunately I have a hard stop at 11, so I need to jump. I apologize, Colin.
Understood. But David, do you want to bring us home?
Sure. I love this question, by the way, but the one that really gets me, and this has come up, is the elderly woman who has air conditioning and isn't using it in the middle of this heat wave because she can't afford it. That just kills me, and it's just wrong. And I'll leave it there.
Let's leave it on that note, but let's also leave it on the note that we're changing this, right? This has been a fantastic conversation. So much was said, so much was shared. I'm stating the obvious, but thank you for enlightening me on all of this. I hope this is great for our audience as well, especially in other countries, and especially it's later in the day there. So this is a great way to end your productive day. But thank you everyone for having us. Thank you all for speaking here. And with that, I will turn it back over to Cora.
Thank you. Thank you for this very, very great discussion. Thank you, Colin, for moderating today's discussion, and thank you, Heather, David, and Medina, and also thank you to Sarah for sharing your insights and how we can create a more sustainable future for everybody. I hope everyone was able to take away some key insight from today's event. It's been a real pleasure to walking you through the program today, and we here at GACC West appreciate you all turning in. Please also join us for our second part of the Transatlantic Energy Efficiency Forum that will take place in 2 days on Thursday, the 22nd. We will discuss carbonizing buildings, the role of electrification with experts from Germany and Washington, and you can sign up for free on Eventbrite. If anyone has any further questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. Our contact information can be found on our website, gaccwest.com. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, and stay safe.